Hello all, welcome to my channel, and today I am reviewing Sound of Hope, the story of Possum Trot, which I got to see 2 weeks early. This movie will be releasing July 4th, brought to you by Angel Studio, who last year had the summer sensation of Sound of Freedom, which I know some people are already just off-put by the name Sound of Freedom. So before we get there, I just do want to talk about some of my feelings about that. I think I did review Sound of Freedom last year, but I just want to give a brief insight, and please just give me a chance for 30 seconds. That's all I beg of you. But with Sound of Freedom, there was so much noise. The way people were writing about this film, the way people were engaging with this, and I found it to be a lot of just disingenuous writing / debate / talks about this film from both sides, to be completely honest. I thought there was some really just shockingly lack of nuanced exploration of this, and that made both sides just feel really a little petty in some ways, or just overly defensive, and it just didn't make for a good discourse at all, and I thought everyone was of the worst of it. And I think this had to do with the way that this film was released to audiences, and specifically the pay it forward model, which we'll get to in a second. But Sound of Hope, the story of Possum Trot, is inspired by a true story which follows Donna and Reverend Martin, a married couple, as they ignite a fire in the hearts of their rural church to embrace kids in the foster care that no one else would take in. This film stars Nika King as Donna, Demetrius Grosse as her husband, Reverend Martin, Elizabeth Mitchell as Susan Ramsey. Those are the three big players in this film. And in talking about Sound of Hope, the story of Possum Trot, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be splitting this video essentially in two. The first half of this video is going to be my review of Sound of Hope. The second part is going to be a larger discussion on Angel Studios as it relates to this movie. But let's just get into my review, which again, I saw this movie today, June 19th, and I want to also make this point really clear so no one can accuse me of anything like that. I went into this movie completely blind. I didn't read anything about it. I didn't know the story of Possum Trot. I hadn't read any of the forefront discussions about it. I didn't do any of that. I didn't read even the Angel Studio website description of this movie. Even when I bought the ticket this morning, I didn't read the summation or summary of this movie. I really just didn't want to go in with any knowledge of this movie, so I could be as essentially as clean of a slate as I can be going into a movie. So I didn't have any of these biases in my head, or just knowing what some of the discourse would be in it. I just want to make that clear, so when we're talking about my review, you guys know where I'm coming from as a reviewer and critic. And I thought Sound of Hope, the story of Possum Trot, I thought this film was fairly formulaic, but formula is not a bad thing, and I thought they used the formula to fairly effective marks. And the big thing that I just want to talk about, which is probably the big difference between Sound of Freedom and Sound of Hope that I saw, was, and again, I thought Sound of Freedom, I reviewed it on this channel last year, I thought the movie was fine. I thought the discourse of it was just so overly blown for a movie that I found neither bad nor good. I thought it was a movie that, to be honest, was very forgettable for me, but I didn't really have a strong reaction while watching it one way or the other. And in this movie, Sound of Hope, I will say I was swayed a little bit more in one direction, where I had a far more positive reaction than I did to their last effort, or the last Sound of effort. I thought Sound of Hope offered far better performances. I think all three of the major performances in this film are really good. Nika King, who plays Donna in this movie, the mother character, I thought she was quite good in this role, as did I think Demetrius Grosse was quite good in this role. I believe their chemistry. I believe this relationship. I thought their emotion with the kids worked to really wonderful effects in Sound of Hope. And so I bought in on that. And with that, there was then able to be genuine, heartfelt emotion found within this film's runtime. I believe there are actual honest moments of human authenticity that didn't feel manufactured, that were real, where you felt a connection and you cared for these characters. And so that also really worked to the film's benefit. And emotionally, I was engaged throughout. And I think this is a really key point, even if I am not the target audience of this movie, because this movie is very clearly a Christian film. It has a very Christian way of looking at this movie. Even if I am not the complete target audience of it, it didn't feel alienating. You could watch this movie and understand the emotion and understand the feelings and thoughts and all of that without feeling like it was not made for you. So there is an inherent accessibility to the story. Maybe it's because it's about parents and kids, traumas that kids face and wanting to protect children. So maybe that is just almost like the olive branch that's being reached out so everyone can at least bring something into this movie. This movie, what it reminded me the most of, it was a 2018 film called Instant Family starring Mark Wahlberg and Rose Byrne. Movie I find quite delightful. But like I said, so for the most part, while watching Sound of Hope, I was far more impressed than I was with Sound of Freedom. I legitimately was buying into the emotion. I felt myself kind of being swept up by some of the character development of this movie, seeing these characters grow together and form this unique family and how that then affects the community at play. That's not to say that this movie is perfect. In fact, I think there's some really big issues in this movie. And I really want to be careful with this point because some people are going to take this point completely the wrong way. And if I present it wrong, I think it could be borderline offensive. So I'm going to be really careful in how I describe this section of the movie with some of my criticism of it. And what I want to say is there are ways to describe and show a trauma that a child has faced while not feeling exploitive or of poor taste. And I think this film can fall into an uneasy feeling of manipulative. And that manipulation in the emotion not only doesn't serve to be effective, but brings together this idea of feeling like it is in poor taste. And I thought that was true in certain scenes of Sound of Hope. So there's specifically a scene where images of the children's abuse is shown to almost sway parents to kind of understand the severity of what these children have faced at the hands of their abuser or the life circumstances that these kids have found themselves in growing up. And I understand the reaction to if you don't see something that you then can just compartmentalize the trauma and understand it, but the visceral reaction is lost. And I think there is truth in that. And I also think there is a way to show imagery in a movie and have it be impactful, but not of poor taste. And this is a really complicated one because it's going to be case by case issue. But in my opinion, while watching the film, I thought this scene was delivered in poor taste. And I found that a few times in the movie. That's not to say the whole effect of this movie is in poor taste, but there were moments of it where I thought some of the portrayal of some of these traumas was in poor taste and not actually serving the narrative, but to elicit a very emotional type response that feels manufactured rather than genuine. It almost worked as a shortcut to get us to a point of feeling in this movie and that directness just didn't work for me. And as a story about community, I think we just needed to see more of the community, especially as their beliefs change and their hearts soften. There's a moment really early on in the film where we see one of the women in the town essentially is like, kind of like, be wary, don't do this. Like, this was the experience of one of my, I think it's her sister or her aunt or someone like that. And basically how this adoption process all went wrong, what had happened. And that's really the only engagement that we get with that side of the argument. And then that's like the one perspective of a townsperson going like essentially, but, and then like from there on, the community seems pretty all in on it. I think I wanted to see a little bit more of the community learning to embrace it and steadily seeing that, because it really just goes from 0 to 100 with this community. And I think that community just needed a little bit more nuanced, and to essentially see how the Reverend and his wife, how they're treating it, how their hearts quite literally soften in front of them, and how that really just causes institutional change. But besides that, my criticisms are, you can tell like they're genuine, but I thought the actual pros of the movie outweigh that. And there's some pretty effective scenes. One scene that I want to talk about real quick, which is actually going to work as a transitional to my further discussion of Angel Studios, is there's a pretty effective scene with Reverend Martin and another local pastor whose church is clearly more well off than Reverend Martin's church is. They're clearly more in a suburban type neighborhood. And this church is focusing on millions of dollars of renovations that seem far more cosmetic. And it brings this argument with Reverend Martin and this pastor, which is essentially the hypocrisy to not give to Reverend Martin, to POSSUM Trot's efforts, and that this church has all the money that can make such great differences, but their lack of willingness / their far more concerns with the aesthetic of the church and, you know, being comfortable outweighs that. And that's where some of the hypocrisy is, this hypocrisy not to give, despite how easy it would be for this church to seemingly give. And I ultimately bring my review to an end with this point, because it ultimately, this idea really comes back into play towards the end of the film. And now we're going to start talking about the end of this movie, which I do not think this is a spoiler, but if the very case, in case you are a little bit worried, we could be getting into spoiler territory. But again, I don't think we are, especially if you've seen Sound of Freedom, because what I'm talking about isn't a spoiler about the actual story. It's just how this film ends. And this film all leads to what feels like this ending of the film, which again, I don't think is a spoiler, especially if you saw Sound of Freedom, but this movie ends with an epilogue of the people of Possum Trot now. We see the families, we see some of the main characters in this movie, where they are, what they've done with their lives, etc., etc. And then we cut to the real Reverend Martin and his wife, Donna, who explain the purpose of Sound of Hope, the story of Possum Trot. And they really lay out a few fundamentals of this movie.
The goal is to bring together this army of hope, starting this 4th of July, 1 million strong, for the 100,000 kids in America who need a home.
There's this QR code, I believe, that like pops up next to them. And essentially they want you to scan it. And as they describe it in their own words, they want you to scan, buy a ticket, essentially pay it forward, get someone to pay for someone else's ticket so that message of Sound of Hope could continue to spread on and more people would be aware of it. And then in utilizing the website and getting more people aware of this issue and how to help on the website, there's essentially this resources on what you can do today, which includes contacting into your local adoption agencies, ways to give, etc., etc. This is a formula used to great success for Sound of Freedom last year. And this isn't necessarily a criticism of this formula. I think it's actually good that studios are experimenting with ways to get people into the theaters and engage an audience. So this new style of pay it forward, I just think it's kind of the natural progression of what we've seen, stuff like Patreon, basically subscription type services of a single content creator, if you will. And so that's not really what I'm talking about. But again, this idea of hypocrisy that I mentioned earlier with the Reverend and the Reverend and the pastor of the suburban church, this hypocrisy of not giving it. Like I said, it all kind of ties back to the end of this movie where you were fortunate enough to buy a ticket to this movie. Now give someone else the chance to see this. So this important message and themes of this movie can be spread across America and the world. And I just want to talk about some of this is, I think, a real criticism that I have of Angel Studios marketing, but I don't want to necessarily attach it to the film done by Joshua Lyle as the director, and then Joshua and Rebecca, who produced and wrote this film. I want to detach it right here, because I think you can watch this entire movie and you don't really need to get to this essentially epilogue. It's not the entirety of this movie, but it is, I think, the kind of core frustration that people had with Sound of Freedom. And here's what I'm going to say about this. And again, I'm trying to be really careful and sensitive on how I describe it and be as nuanced and thoughtful as I can about this entire discussion. But in this movie, when this scene pops up, and I should just mention, after the pastor and his wife appear, then we have Elizabeth Mitchell as Susan Ramsey, the social worker in this film. She pops up, and essentially that same QR code comes up, and she tells you how you can help a child in need. And so I decided, and here's a picture that I took in theater so you guys could get a reference for what I was talking about. And then so I decided to scan that QR code, go to this website, kind of see what the whole deal is. And the one thing that I kept noticing is it is a complete advertisement for Sound of Hope. They got it plastered everywhere. It's very easy to figure out how to buy a ticket. And then if you can kind of continue navigating the website, then you can figure out how to see the community resources. That doesn't seem as big of the priority of this. But the one thing that I did take note of is the actress Elizabeth Mitchell in this epilogue / however you want to call it, scene that plays over the credits, says that Angel Studios is not a traditional Hollywood studios. It doesn't have the type of funding, all that. Like, we need you to essentially make this movie a sensation, which is probably true. It's very fair that Angel Studios doesn't have the wide scale Hollywood distribution style and all of that. Sound of Freedom made $200 million plus last year. It outgrossed domestically Mission Impossible 7. The movie made a lot of money. Sound of Hope was made on an $8 million budget. That's the reported budget of Sound of Hope. This isn't like this really small indie movie. There's been a lot of movies made for far less and made by studios that have never come close to grossing 200 plus million. I think it grossed 200 million domestically too, which is just insane. There's a lot of studios that have never come close to that number. And the reason I point this out is because this is where I noticed the hypocrisy of Angel Studios. Because again, when you scan this QR code, you're essentially like, the main goal is to have you buy a ticket. And it's kind of like the main goal that you see in like what Elizabeth Mitchell's talking about, where it's just like, do this, buy the ticket, get the cause going, blah, blah, blah. And then if you like to basically end it, she's like, and then if you want some community resources here, they're on the website, blah, blah, blah. Like, it really does feel like the community resources connecting with local agencies, that's kind of a yada yada over at the very end, almost like oh yeah, we have to talk about this. But it really does feel like it is all in the idea of making you buy a ticket to pay it forward so they can essentially replicate a similar success to Sound of Freedom, which proved quite profitable for them. The reason I have issues with this is, again, it's this idea of the hypocrisy that we see of Reverend Martin and the suburban church leader, which is, I think this film is presenting itself more like Reverend Martin, but in reality, the distribution probably implies they're more like the suburban church in this scenario, just due to the amount of success that they had last year with Sound of Freedom. And again, I understand there's finances of all this. I understand that movies aren't cheap to make, all that, and that they can get away with some of this stuff because they're able to engage this base. And again, I don't have necessarily an issue with it. It's just the way of presenting it. And what I found just hypocritical about it is, again, it really felt like the idea of this pay it forward wasn't to necessarily help kids. The idea of helping kids was go see this movie and support this type of movie so these types of stories can be told. And then also additionally, there's resources available on our website etc. I found it to be far more corporate and capitalism driven, I guess, as you will say, where when you scan this QR code, it's to buy the ticket, and it feels like the ideas of the movie helping and supporting these ideas is secondary. It really is, if you support this cause, get other people to see this movie so we can keep telling stories like this. And then also, here's some community resources for you, and here's how to connect to a local agency. But again, that kind of feels like an afterthought. And maybe this wouldn't feel as hypocritical or gross in my mind if it was like, scan this QR code, buy a ticket, and 50% of that ticket sale will then go to an agency in need or go to a family in need, however they want to do it. And then that way it's like, oh, okay, I am continuing to spread the message of this movie, but I am also doing a practical giving way that really benefit. Right now, it almost feels like money into the studio, and then just having the resources there is like kind of the honor, the help that it brings more awareness. Like, it's almost like social media engagement. Like, oh, you're involved with us, so more people are aware of you. Not necessarily more people are clicking or doing anything with that information. That's where I found it, and I hope I described that well enough. But anyway, Sound of Hope, the story of Possum Trot, I found largely effective. I'm not going to say this is the best movie of the year by any means. I don't even think this is a really great movie, but I thought it was a movie that was hit the goal that it was supposed to and served its purpose. And I found it to be more engaging than not. And even if I have some criticisms of it, I thought it was a movie that worked more than it didn't. For that, I'm giving Sound of Hope, the story of Possum Trot, 3 out of 5 stars. Thank you so much for watching. And if you like this video, make sure to like and subscribe to my channel.